The sun was bleeding across the Kansas horizon when Frank O'Brien found the woman kneeling by the dried-up creek bed, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to tear right through her. He had been riding hard from Newton, trying to outrun his own demons, when he heard the sound of her crying carried on the evening wind. The year was 1878, and in all his 26 years, he had never heard such raw anguish from another human being. Frank dismounted slowly, letting his boots hit the dusty ground with soft thuds. His horse, a steady buckskin mare named Daisy, huffed softly and stood still without needing to be tied. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle the woman, his hand instinctively moving away from the colt at his hip to show he meant no harm. "Madam." His voice was rough from days of riding through the prairie dust, but he gentled it as much as he could. "Are you hurt?" The woman's head jerked up, and Frank found himself looking into the most striking pair of green eyes he had ever seen. They were red-rimmed and swimming with tears, but even in her distress, she was beautiful. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins and tumbled around her shoulders in waves. Her dress was simple calico, torn at the hem and dusty from travel. She scrambled to her feet, wiping at her face with trembling hands. "Please, I do not need any trouble, just let me be." Frank held up both hands, staying where he was. "I am not here to cause trouble. I heard you crying and thought maybe you needed help." He glanced around the empty prairie, seeing no horse, no wagon, nothing. "Where is your mount, your wagon?" Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Gone, all gone." "They took everything." His jaw tightened. "Who took everything?" "3 men. They came upon my wagon this morning. My husband, he tried to fight them, but they shot him. They took our horses, our supplies, even the money we had hidden." Her voice broke. "Thomas is dead. I buried him myself with just my hands and rocks from the creek bed, because I had nothing else." Frank's heart clenched at her words. He had seen plenty of violence in his years, working cattle drives and occasionally helping the marshal in Newton, but the senselessness of it never got easier to stomach. "I am real sorry for your loss, madam. That is a terrible thing." She wrapped her arms around herself, looking so small and lost against the vast prairie. "I do not know what to do. I have been walking for hours trying to find help, but there is nothing out here. I thought maybe I could reach Newton, but I do not even know which direction to go anymore." The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Frank knew that nightfall on the prairie was dangerous for anyone alone, let alone a woman who had just lost everything. Whatever predators might come, human or animal, she would be defenseless. "Madam, whatever it is, you do not have to face it alone," he said quietly, taking a few steps closer. "My name is Frank O'Brien. I have a ranch about 10 miles from Newton. It is not much, but it is safe and warm. I can take you there, get you cleaned up and fed, and tomorrow we can ride into town and report what happened to the marshal. He is a good man, and he will do what he can to find those men." She studied him with those red-rimmed green eyes, clearly weighing whether she could trust him. He did not blame her for being cautious. After what she had been through, trusting any man would be difficult. "How do I know you are not like them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank met her gaze steadily. "You do not, I suppose. But I give you my word, on my mother's grave, that I mean you no harm. I will not touch you, will not bother you. I just cannot in good conscience leave you out here alone when night is coming." Something in his words, or maybe just the desperate situation she was in, seemed to convince her. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "All right, thank you. My name is Grace Miller. I was Grace Hopkins before I married Thomas 3 months ago. 3 months. The words hung in the air like a weight. Married only 3 months and now widowed, alone in a harsh land so far from anywhere. Frank felt a surge of protectiveness for this stranger that surprised him with its intensity. "Well, Miss Grace, let us get you on Daisy here and head to the ranch before it gets full dark." He led the mare over and helped Grace mount, trying not to notice how light she felt, how her hands trembled as she gripped the saddle horn. Once she was settled, he took the reins and began walking, leading the horse northwest toward home. They moved in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of leather, the soft footfalls of the horse, and the whisper of wind through the prairie grass. Frank kept his pace steady but not rushed, knowing Grace was likely in shock and exhausted. "Where were you and your husband headed?" he asked after a time, thinking conversation might help keep her from sinking too deep into her grief. "Oregon," she said softly. "Thomas heard there was good farmland to be had, and we thought we could start fresh. We married in Missouri, sold everything we had, and bought a wagon and supplies. We have been traveling for 2 months." She paused, and he heard her take a shaky breath. "Had been traveling, I mean. Now it is just me, and I have nothing, not even enough money to send a telegram to my family back in Missouri." What about his family? He had none. His parents died years ago, and he had no siblings. It was just us. The loneliness in those words was palpable. Frank glanced back at her, seeing how she slumped in the saddle, barely holding herself upright. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning. We had some cornmeal and made johnnycakes over the fire." His frown deepened. No food, no water, and the trauma of losing her husband and being robbed. It was a wonder she was still conscious. "There is a canteen on the saddle. You should drink." Grace fumbled for the canteen and took several long swallows. "Thank you. Once we get to the ranch, my housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, will fix you up something hot. She is a widow who comes by 3 times a week to cook and clean. She stayed late today to make stew, so there should be plenty." "You are very kind to help me like this. Most men would have just ridden past." Frank did not know how to respond to that. He had been raised by a mother who believed in helping those in need, and even though she had been gone for 5 years now, her teaching stayed with him. It is just the right thing to do. As they walked, the landscape gradually changed from open prairie to more rolling hills dotted with scrub brush. Frank's ranch came into view as the last light was fading from the sky. It was modest compared to some of the big spreads in the area, but he had built it himself over the past 8 years. The house was sturdy wood construction with a covered porch, a barn that could hold 6 horses, a chicken coop, and several corrals for the cattle he raised. Warm light glowed in the windows, and Frank felt relief wash over him. Mrs. Patterson was still there, which meant Grace would have another woman to help her, someone who might understand her grief better than he could. He led Daisy up to the porch and called out, "Mrs. Patterson, are you still here?" The door opened, and a stout woman in her 50s stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a sensible bun, and her weathered face showed immediate concern when she saw Grace on the horse. "Good heavens, Frank, what happened?" "This is Miss Grace Miller. She was attacked on the trail. Her husband was killed, and she has been wandering alone all day. She needs food, water, and a safe place to rest." Mrs. Patterson was moving before he finished speaking, coming down the steps with surprising speed for her size. "You poor dear. Come, let us get you inside. Frank, you see to that horse. I will take care of this young lady." Frank helped Grace dismount, steadying her when her legs nearly gave out from exhaustion. Mrs. Patterson slipped an arm around Grace's waist and guided her toward the house, murmuring soothing words. He watched them go, feeling oddly bereft once they disappeared inside. He took his time settling Daisy in the barn, brushing her down and making sure she had feed and fresh water. The familiar routine helped settle his own thoughts. He kept seeing Grace's tear-stained face, kept hearing the break in her voice when she talked about her husband. The senselessness of it made his blood boil. 3 men attacking a couple just trying to make their way west, killing for a wagon and some supplies. It was the kind of thing that reminded him why he preferred the solitude of ranch life to the chaos of towns and people. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie he told himself. He had not always preferred solitude. Once, he had dreamed of having a wife, children, a house full of life and laughter. But that was before Sarah, before she broke their engagement to marry a banker from Topeka, because Frank's ranch was not grand enough, his prospects not certain enough. That had been 3 years ago, and he had told himself he was better off alone. Looking at Grace tonight, though, seeing her vulnerability and her strength in equal measure, something had stirred in his chest that he thought long dead. He shook his head at his own foolishness. The woman had just lost her husband. The last thing she needed was some lonesome cowboy developing feelings for her. She needed help, nothing more, and he would provide it, and then send her on her way to wherever she wanted to go. Decision made, Frank headed back to the house. He could smell the stew even before he opened the door, and his stomach rumbled in response. Inside, he found the main room clean and warm. Mrs. Patterson had Grace seated at the table near the fireplace, a blanket around her shoulders and a bowl of stew in front of her. The older woman was bustling about, pouring coffee and slicing bread. "There you are," Mrs. Patterson said when she saw him. "Sit down and eat. I am sure you are hungry too after your ride." Frank removed his hat and hung it on the peg by the door, then took a seat across from Grace. In the lamplight, he could see her more clearly. She was younger than he had initially thought, probably only 22 or 23. Her face was delicate, with high cheekbones and a straight nose. Despite the dirt and tears, there was something inherently elegant about her. She was eating slowly, mechanically, as if her body knew it needed food but her mind was elsewhere. He did not blame her. Shock did strange things to people. Mrs. Patterson set a bowl in front of him and patted his shoulder. "I will stay the night if you need me, Frank." The girl should not be alone. "That would be appreciated, Mrs. Patterson, thank you. No thanks needed. It is the Christian thing to do." She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table with them. "Grace was just telling me a bit about what happened. Terrible business. Simply terrible." They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the crackle of the fire. Frank found himself watching Grace from the corner of his eye, noticing how her hands had stopped trembling now that she had food and warmth. Some color had returned to her cheeks. When she finally pushed her bowl away, she looked up at him with those haunting green eyes. "Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. I do not know how I can ever repay your kindness." "You do not need to repay anything. I am just glad I found you when I did." "What will happen now?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "I have nothing. No money, no possessions, nowhere to go." Mrs. Patterson reached over and patted her hand. "First thing tomorrow, we will get you cleaned up proper and into some decent clothes. I have some things at home that will fit you. Then Frank can take you into Newton to see Marshal Crawford. He will want a description of these men and where they attacked you." "Do you think he will be able to find them?" Grace asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Frank hated to dash her hopes, but honesty was important. "The prairie is big, and 3 men on horseback can cover a lot of ground. But Marshal Crawford is good at his job. If those men come through Newton or any of the nearby towns, he will hear about it. Men who kill and rob tend to make a pattern of it." Grace nodded, her jaw tightening. "I want them caught, not just for me, but so they cannot do this to anyone else. Thomas did not deserve to die like that. He was a good man, kind and gentle. He never hurt anyone." The grief in her voice was raw, and Frank felt his chest constrict. We will do everything we can to see justice done." Mrs. Patterson stood and began clearing the dishes. "Grace, dear, I have made up the spare bedroom for you. It has a real bed with clean sheets and a wash basin. You should rest." "Tomorrow will be a difficult day." Grace rose slowly, still clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you both. I do not know what I would have done if Mr. O'Brien had not found me. It is Frank, please. No need for formality." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Then you must call me Grace." "Good night, Grace. Sleep as long as you need. We will not rush you in the morning." Mrs. Patterson led Grace down the short hallway to the spare room, leaving Frank alone by the fire. He sat for a long while, nursing his coffee and staring into the flames. His mind kept replaying the moment he had found her, the sound of her sobs cutting through the prairie stillness. Something about Grace called to him in a way he could not quite explain. Maybe it was just his protective instinct, or maybe it was something more. He finally stood and banked the fire for the night. Mrs. Patterson had settled into his mother's old room, and the house was quiet. Frank made his way to his own bedroom, the one he had built onto the house 2 years ago when living in the main room had started to feel too cramped. As he undressed and lay down on his bed, he heard it, the sound of muffled crying coming from the spare room. Grace, finally allowing herself to grieve in private. The sound tore at him, and he found himself wanting to go to her, to offer comfort, but he knew that would be inappropriate. She needed space, needed time to process everything that had happened. So instead, he lay in the dark and listened, his heart aching for a woman he barely knew and wondered what the morning would bring. Frank woke at dawn, as he always did, to the sound of roosters crowing and the first light filtering through his window. He dressed quickly in clean work clothes and made his way to the kitchen, surprised to find Mrs. Patterson already up and making breakfast. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air. "Morning, Frank," she said without turning from the stove. "I checked on Grace a bit ago. She is still sleeping. The poor girl was completely exhausted. Let her rest as long as she needs." He poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch, looking over his land as the sun rose. The sky was clear, promising a warm day. He had work to do, fences to check and cattle to tend, but all of that could wait. Helping Grace was more important. He was on his second cup of coffee when he heard the door open behind him. Turning, he found Grace standing there, wearing the same dress from yesterday but looking more rested. Her hair was brushed and pinned back, and though her eyes were still sad, there was a determination in her face that had not been there the night before. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Morning. How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected. The bed was comfortable and it felt safe here." She hugged herself, looking out at the ranch. "It is beautiful here, so peaceful. It is that. Took me years to build it up, but it is home." He gestured to the chair next to him. "Wanna sit? Mrs. Patterson is making breakfast." Grace sat, arranging her skirts carefully. For a few moments, they simply sat in companionable silence, watching the sun climb higher. Frank found himself very aware of her presence, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the sad curve of her mouth. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said suddenly. "Of course." "Why were you out there yesterday? You said you were riding hard from Newton. Were you running from something?" The question caught him off guard. He had been running in a way, though not from anything illegal or dangerous. "I had been in town selling some cattle. Ran into my former fiancée and her husband. It brought up old feelings I thought I had dealt with, so I decided to ride them off." "What happened, if you do not mind my asking?" Frank was not usually one to talk about his personal life, but something about Grace made him want to be honest. "Sarah and I were engaged 4 years ago. I had just bought this land and was building the house. She said she loved me, said she could not wait to be my wife. But as time went on and the ranch did not prosper as quickly as she hoped, she got impatient. A banker from Topeka came through town, saw her at church, and started courting her. She broke our engagement and married him within 3 months. That must have hurt terribly. It did. Felt like my whole world ended. I threw myself into the ranch after that, barely came into town unless I had to, told myself I was better off alone. He took a sip of his coffee. Yesterday was the first time I had seen her in 2 years. She looked happy, had a baby in her arms and another on the way. It reminded me of everything I thought I would have and made me feel bitter, so I left town as fast as I could. Grace was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry that happened to you. It was not fair of her to make promises she did not intend to keep. Life is not always fair, as you well know." "No, it is not." She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "Thomas and I married for practical reasons at first. My father died, leaving my mother and me with nothing. Thomas worked at the general store where my mother and I shopped. He was always kind to us, and when he proposed, it seemed like a good solution. I would have a husband and security, and he would have a wife to help him on his journey west. But you grew to care for him." "I did. He was gentle and patient. He never rushed me, never demanded anything I was not ready to give. In the 3 months we were married, I learned to love him, and now he is gone, and I feel like I was cheated out of the life we could have had together." Frank understood that feeling all too well. Grief is a hard thing to carry. "Yes, it is." Mrs. Patterson called them in for breakfast, and they ate together in the warm kitchen. The food was good and hearty, and Frank noticed Grace ate with more appetite than she had the night before. That was a good sign. After breakfast, Mrs. Patterson went home to fetch some clothes for Grace while Frank tended to some necessary chores around the ranch. When the older woman returned a few hours later, she had a carpet bag full of dresses, undergarments, and other necessities. Grace tried on several of the dresses, and while they were a bit large, Mrs. Patterson was handy with a needle and thread. She made quick adjustments so that the clothing fit well enough. Seeing Grace in a clean blue dress with white trim, her hair properly arranged, Frank was struck again by how beautiful she was. The thought made him feel guilty, given the circumstances, but he could not deny it. By midday, they were ready to make the trip into Newton. Mrs. Patterson decided to accompany them, sitting in the back of Frank's wagon while Grace sat on the bench seat next to him. The ride into town took about an hour, and Frank kept the conversation light, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the area. Newton was a bustling cattle town, established in 1871 when the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway reached the area. By 1878, it had grown into a proper town with a main street lined with businesses, several saloons, a church, a school, and a marshal's office. Cattle drives still came through, though not as frequently as in the early years, and the town had settled into a rhythm of commerce and community. Frank guided the wagon down Main Street, nodding to people he knew as they passed. He could feel the curious stares directed at Grace, could almost hear the gossip starting. A new woman in town, riding with Frank O'Brien no less, would be the talk of the day. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the marshal's office and helped Grace down. Mrs. Patterson stayed with the wagon, saying she had some shopping to do. Inside the office, Marshal Crawford looked up from his desk. He was a man in his 50s with iron gray hair and a weathered face that had seen plenty of trouble in its time. But his eyes were kind, and Frank had always respected him. "Frank, good to see you. What brings you to town?" His gaze shifted to Grace, and his expression turned curious. "Marshal, this is Miss Grace Miller. She was attacked yesterday on the trail west of here. Her husband was killed and she was robbed. I found her last evening and brought her to my ranch. She needs to make a report." Marshal Crawford's expression turned grim. "I am real sorry for your loss, madam. Please, sit down and tell me everything." Grace took the offered chair and, with a remarkably steady voice considering the subject matter, recounted everything that had happened. She described the three men as best she could, their horses, the direction they had been heading. Marshal Crawford took careful notes, asking clarifying questions now and then. "I will send telegrams to the surrounding towns. Let them know to be on the lookout for these men. Can you tell me exactly where your husband is buried?" "I will need to send someone out to investigate the scene and give him a proper burial." Grace's composure cracked at that. "I marked the spot with a pile of stones. It is about 2 miles west of where the creek bends north, near a stand of cottonwood trees. I know the area. I will ride out there myself this afternoon." Marshal Crawford looked at Frank. "Are you taking care of Miss Miller? She is staying at my ranch for now. Mrs. Patterson is there to chaperone." "Good. Miss Miller, do you have family I should contact?" "My mother in Missouri. But I do not have money for a telegram." "I will send it on the town's account. It is the least we can do. If you write down her name and where she lives, I will get the message out today." Grace wrote down the information with trembling hands. When she was done, Marshal Crawford stood and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We will do everything we can to find the men who did this. In the meantime, you are in good hands with Frank. He is one of the most honorable men I know." They left the marshal's office and found Mrs. Patterson at the general store. She had purchased fabric, thread, and various supplies, including some personal items for Grace. Frank paid for everything despite Grace's protests. "You can repay me later if you want," he said firmly. "Right now, you need these things." As they were loading the wagon, a woman's voice called out, "Frank? Frank O'Brien, is that you?" Frank felt his stomach sink. He turned to see Sarah walking toward them, a small child toddling beside her holding her hand. She looked much as she had yesterday, prosperous and content in a fine dress with her hair elegantly arranged. "Sarah," he said stiffly. Her eyes went immediately to Grace, curiosity bright in her expression. "I heard you were in town with a lady friend. I had to see for myself." "This is Miss Grace Miller. She is staying at my ranch temporarily. Grace, this is Sarah Tompkins." Grace, bless her, picked up on the tension immediately and gave Sarah a polite but cool nod. "Pleased to meet you." Sarah's smile was sharp. "How nice. I did not think Frank would ever bring a woman around after, well, you know." Frank felt his temper rise. "If you will excuse us, Sarah, we need to be going." But Sarah was not done. "It is just such a surprise. Frank always seemed so content being alone. I do hope you know what you are getting into, Miss Miller. Ranch life is terribly hard and lonely." "I am learning that life is hard everywhere," Grace said quietly, but with an edge to her voice that made Frank look at her in surprise. "But I am also learning that good people make all the difference. Good day, Mrs. Tompkins." She turned and climbed into the wagon without waiting for help, her back straight and her head held high. Frank had to suppress a smile as he followed suit, tipping his hat to a flustered-looking Sarah before taking the reins. As they pulled away, Mrs. Patterson leaned forward from the back. "That woman is a viper, always has been. You handled her well," Frank said to Grace. "I have little patience for petty cruelty right now," Grace replied. "Life is too short to waste on people like that." The ride back to the ranch was quieter, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Frank helped Grace down and their hands touched briefly. He felt a spark of something, a connection he could not quite name, and from the way Grace's eyes widened, he thought she felt it too. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Mrs. Patterson came each morning and left each evening, leaving Frank and Grace with carefully chaperoned time together. Grace helped with small tasks around the ranch, feeding chickens and gathering eggs, helping with meals, mending clothes. She seemed to find solace in staying busy. Frank found himself looking forward to her presence. She was intelligent and had a quiet sense of humor that would surface at unexpected moments. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father who had been a teacher, about her mother who made the best apple pie in 3 counties. He told her about building the ranch, about his plans to expand the herd, about the harsh winters and the beautiful springs. They were careful not to touch, mindful of propriety and the fact that Grace was still in mourning. But there was an undeniable pull between them, a growing affection that neither of them acknowledged aloud. A week after Grace's arrival, Marshall Crawford rode out to the ranch. Frank saw him coming and went to meet him, Grace following close behind. "Marshall," Frank said in greeting. "Any news?" Crawford dismounted, his expression grim. "I investigated the site where Miss Miller was attacked, found the grave she made for her husband and saw signs of a struggle. I also found some tracks that led east toward Wichita. I sent deputies in that direction and telegrams to law enforcement along the way." "Have you heard anything back?" Grace asked, her voice tight. "Not yet, but these things take time. I also received a telegram from your mother. She sends her love and says she wishes she could come, but she cannot afford the journey. She asks that you stay where you are safe and write to her when you can." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for telling me." After Marshall Crawford left, Grace went to her room and stayed there for several hours. When she finally emerged, her eyes were red, but her expression was resolute. "I need to start thinking about my future. I cannot impose on your hospitality forever." Frank felt a pang at the thought of her leaving. "You are not imposing. You are welcome to stay as long as you need." "But what will I do? I have no money, no way to support myself. I cannot rely on your charity indefinitely. There are options. You could find work in Newton. Mrs. Patterson mentioned the schoolteacher is looking to retire. If you can read and write well, you might be able to take her position." Grace brightened slightly. "I can do more than read and write. My father was a teacher, and he made sure I had a thorough education. I have read classics, studied mathematics, even learned some Latin." "Then you are more than qualified. Why do not we ride into town tomorrow and inquire about it?" The next day they did just that. The schoolteacher, a kind older woman named Miss Abernathy, was delighted to meet Grace. They talked for over an hour about curriculum and teaching methods, and by the end of the conversation, Miss Abernathy was practically begging Grace to take over the position when she retired at the end of the current term in 2 months. "I will need to train you, of course," Miss Abernathy said, her eyes twinkling. "But I can see you have the knowledge and the temperament for it. The town provides a small house for the teacher and a modest salary. It is not much, but it is honest work." Grace accepted, and as they left the schoolhouse, Frank could see the relief in her expression. "I cannot believe it. I was so worried about what I would do, and now I have a position waiting for me." "You earned it with your own qualifications," Frank said. "You should be proud." But even as he said it, he felt a hollowness in his chest. In 2 months, Grace would move to the teacher's house in Newton. She would have her own life, her own purpose. And while he was happy for her, he also realized how much he had come to care for her, how much he would miss her when she was gone. The weeks passed quickly. Grace accompanied Miss Abernathy to the schoolhouse several times a week to learn the routine and meet the children. She also helped Frank around the ranch more, learning to ride properly, helping him move cattle from one pasture to another, even learning to rope despite her protests that it was unladylike. "There is nothing wrong with a woman knowing practical skills," Frank told her as he showed her how to coil a lasso. "Besides, you are good at it." They were standing close, his hands guiding hers on the rope, and the moment stretched between them. Grace looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. But then she stepped back, clearing her throat. "I should get back to the house. Mrs. Patterson will be expecting help with dinner." Frank watched her go, his hands still tingling from where they had touched hers. He was falling for her, had been falling for her since the moment he found her crying at sunset. But she was still grieving her husband, still trying to find her footing in a new life. The last thing he wanted was to pressure her or make her feel obligated to return his feelings out of gratitude. So he kept his distance, even though it was getting harder every day. Marshall Crawford came by the ranch again 3 weeks after his first visit. This time, his news was better. "We caught 2 of the men. They tried to sell some distinctive items in Wichita that matched the description of what was taken from your wagon. They are in custody and will stand trial." "What about the 3rd man?" Grace asked. "Still at large, but we are looking for him. The 2 we caught are talking, trying to make deals." "We will find him." "Will I need to testify at the trial?" "Most likely, yes, but that will not be for a few months yet. The circuit judge does not come through until fall." After the marshal left, Grace was quiet for the rest of the day. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she finally spoke. "I thought I would feel better, knowing they caught some of the men, but I just feel empty." "Justice does not bring back what was lost," Frank said quietly. "It just gives a sense of things being made right, in whatever small way possible." Thomas has been gone for nearly a month now. Sometimes it feels like years, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. I still think I see him out of the corner of my eye, or I start to tell him something before I remember he is not here. She wiped at her eyes. "Is it wrong that I am starting to feel happy again, that there are moments when I forget to be sad?" "No, it is not wrong. He would not want you to be sad forever." "How do you know?" "Because he loved you, and people who love want those they leave behind to live and be happy." Grace turned to look at him, really look at him, and Frank felt the weight of her gaze. "You are a good man, Frank O'Brien. One of the best I have ever known. I am just a cowboy trying to do right. You are more than that. You saved my life, gave me a home when I had nothing, helped me find a purpose again. I will never be able to repay that. I do not want repayment." The words came out more forcefully than he intended. "I helped you because I wanted to, because leaving you there was not an option for me. And if I am honest, having you here has been good for me too. This place was lonely before you came. I did not realize how lonely until I had someone to share it with." The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken feelings. Grace reached out slowly and took his hand. Her fingers were small and warm in his, and Frank felt his heart hammer in his chest. "I care about you," she said softly. "I know it has not been long, and I know people will say I am rushing or that it is not proper, but I cannot help how I feel. You have been my rock through the worst time in my life, and somewhere along the way, you became important to me." Frank squeezed her hand gently. "I care about you too, Grace, more than I probably should, but I do not want to rush you or make you feel like you owe me anything. You are still grieving, still finding your way." "I am, but that does not mean my feelings for you are not real. Thomas was good to me, and I will always honor his memory. But he is gone, and I am still here. I still have a life to live." She looked out at the sunset, at the gold and crimson sky. "The first time you found me, I was crying because I thought my life was over. Now I am starting to think maybe it is just beginning. A different life than I planned, but maybe one that can be good too." "It can be," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you will let me, I would like to be part of that life. not as a replacement for what you lost, but as something new. Something real. Grace turned back to him, tears shining in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of grief. I would like that too. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her cheek with his free hand. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly. Then he leaned in and kissed her, soft and gentle, a promise and a question all at once. Grace kissed him back, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, over his heart. The kiss was sweet and tender, full of new beginnings and hope. When they finally pulled apart, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "We will take this slow," he said. "No rushing, no pressure, we have time." "Time," Grace agreed. "That sounds good." They sat together as the sun finished setting, hands entwined, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to deep blue. For the first time in years, Frank felt at peace, and from the soft smile on Grace's face, he thought maybe she felt the same. The next 2 months passed in a blur of happiness. Grace continued her training with Miss Abernathy while also spending her free time at the ranch. She and Frank grew closer, though they were careful to maintain propriety. Mrs. Patterson was a constant presence, but even she began to soften, occasionally leaving them alone for short periods. They talked about everything, learning each other's hopes and dreams, fears and regrets. Frank told her about his childhood, about growing up on a small farm in Illinois before his parents decided to move west for opportunities. About how his father died of pneumonia the first winter in Kansas, leaving him and his mother to manage alone. About how his mother worked herself to exhaustion to keep them fed and clothed, teaching him the value of hard work and integrity until her heart gave out when he was 21. Grace shared more about her own past, about her father's love of learning, and how he had made their small home feel rich with knowledge even when money was scarce. About nursing him through the consumption that took his life, and the desperation she and her mother felt afterward when they realized how little they had. About accepting Thomas's proposal not out of love at first but out of necessity, and how guilty that had made her feel even as she grew to genuinely care for him. "You think he knew?" she asked one evening as they walked along the creek that ran through Frank's property. "That I married him for security first and love second. Does it matter? You did grow to love him. You were a good wife to him in the time you had. That is what counts." "I suppose you are right. I just do not want to repeat old patterns. I do not want you to ever think I care for you because of what you can provide rather than who you are." Frank stopped walking and turned to face her. "Grace, I know your feelings are real. I can see it in your eyes when you look at me, hear it in your voice when you say my name. You are not a woman who pretends." She smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "No, I am not. And I am not pretending when I say I love you." The words hung in the air between them. It was the first time either of them had said it explicitly, and Frank felt his heart swell. "I love you too. Have loved you for weeks now. Maybe since that first night when you were so brave despite everything you had lost." He kissed her there by the creek, with the water bubbling over stones and the late afternoon sun filtering through the cottonwood leaves. It was a perfect moment, one Frank knew he would remember for the rest of his life. When they returned to the house, Mrs. Patterson took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly. "Well, it is about time you two admitted what everyone else could see plain as day. Are we that obvious?" Grace asked, blushing. "My dear girl, Frank has been looking at you like you hung the moon since the day he brought you here, and you have been looking at him the same way for nearly as long. I am just glad you finally said something to each other." The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Frank had ever known. He and Grace were courting openly now, and while there was some gossip in town about the speed of things, most people were supportive. The story of how Frank had saved Grace and taken her in had spread, and public opinion was largely in their favor. Miss Abernathy officially retired, and Grace took over the schoolhouse. Frank helped her move into the teacher's cottage, a small but neat house just off Main Street. He did not like being separated from her, but they saw each other often. He came to town twice a week to have dinner with her, and she came out to the ranch on Sundays after church. One Sunday in late October, as they sat on his porch watching the autumn leaves blow across the yard, Frank knew it was time. He had been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. "Grace, can I ask you something?" She looked at him, her green eyes warm and trusting. "Of course." He took her hand, his heart pounding. "I know we have not been together long by some standards, but I have lived enough life to know that time is not as important as how you feel. Every morning I wake up, you are my first thought. Every evening I fall asleep thinking about you. You have brought joy and purpose back into my life in a way I never expected." He pulled the ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small emerald. "This was my grandmother's. She gave it to my mother, and my mother left it to me before she died. I have been waiting for the right woman to give it to, and I know without a doubt that woman is you. Grace Miller, will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes. Yes, Frank, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, pouring all his love and hope into that embrace. They were married a month later in the small church in Newton. Mrs. Patterson stood up with Grace, and Marshall Crawford stood with Frank. The entire town turned out for the wedding, and even Sarah Tompkins attended, though she looked rather sour throughout the ceremony. Grace was beautiful in a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew. Her dark blonde hair was arranged with small white flowers woven through it, and her green eyes shone with happiness. When Frank saw her walking down the aisle toward him, he felt his throat tighten with emotion. The preacher kept the ceremony simple and heartfelt. When it came time to say their vows, Frank spoke from the heart. "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by your side through whatever comes. I promise to make you laugh, to listen when you need to talk, and to be the partner you deserve." Grace's voice was steady as she replied, "I promise to love you with my whole heart, to build a life with you filled with joy and purpose, and to be grateful every day for the man who found me at my lowest and showed me kindness when I needed it most." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed his bride to applause and cheers from the assembled crowd. They walked out of the church hand in hand into the bright November sunshine, ready to begin their new life together. The reception was held at the schoolhouse, which had been decorated with autumn leaves and ribbons. There was food and dancing, and Frank held Grace close as they swayed to the music. She fit perfectly in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," she replied. "Thank you for being patient with me, for giving me time to heal. You were worth waiting for." They stayed at the party until late evening, but eventually they slipped away to head back to the ranch. Frank had spent the past week fixing up the house, adding special touches to make Grace feel welcome. Fresh curtains in the bedroom, a new rug in the main room, wildflowers in a vase on the table. When they arrived, he carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the tradition. Inside, he set her down gently and just looked at her, still hardly believing she was his wife. "I love you, Grace O'Brien," he said. "I love you too, Frank, now and always." That night, they came together as husband and wife with tenderness and passion, celebrating their union and the new chapter of their lives. Frank was gentle with Grace, mindful that this was a new beginning for both of them. She responded with warmth and trust, and in the quiet darkness of their bedroom they found joy and connection. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Grace's head on Frank's chest, his arm wrapped around her. "I never thought I would have this again," she murmured. A home, a husband, a future to look forward to. There were days after Thomas died when I thought about just giving up, letting the prairie swallow me. I am glad you did not. I am glad I found you when I did. So am I. It is strange how life works. Losing everything led me to you. I would not have wished for the pain I went through, but I cannot regret where it brought me. Frank kissed the top of her head. "We will build a good life together. I promise you that." They fell asleep in each other's arms, content and hopeful for the future. The first year of their marriage was full of adjustments and growth. Grace continued teaching during the school year, and Frank continued running his ranch. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, supporting each other's work while building their life together. In the spring, Grace discovered she was with child. She told Frank one evening after dinner, her eyes shining with joy and a touch of nervousness. "I know we have not been married long, but I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." Frank swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her protests. "That is wonderful news, the best news." He set her down gently, suddenly worried. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need to see the doctor?" Grace laughed. "I am fine. Women have babies all the time. But yes, I will see the doctor soon to make sure everything is progressing well." Over the next months, Frank was attentive to the point of being overbearing. He worried constantly about Grace, did not want her lifting anything heavy or working too hard. She finally had to sit him down and firmly tell him that she was pregnant, not dying, and he needed to let her live normally. "I am just worried," he admitted. "I do not want anything to happen to you or the baby." "Nothing will happen. I am healthy and strong, and Dr. Matthews says the pregnancy is going perfectly. You need to trust that." He tried, though it was difficult. The thought of losing Grace was unbearable, and now there was a child to worry about too, but he did his best to give her space while still being supportive. In November, a week before their first anniversary, Grace went into labor. Mrs. Patterson and the doctor were summoned, and Frank was banished to the barn to pace and worry. The hours dragged by, and he found himself praying to a God he had not spoken to in years, begging for Grace and the baby to be safe. Finally, as the sun was setting, Mrs. Patterson came to fetch him. "You have a son," she said with a tired smile. "Both mother and baby are healthy." Frank nearly collapsed with relief. He rushed into the house to find Grace propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She smiled when she saw him. "Come meet your son." He approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at the tiny face peeking out of the blanket. The baby was perfect, with a dusting of dark hair and a scrunched-up face. "He is beautiful," Frank whispered. "We made him together," Grace said softly. "Our miracle. What should we name him?" Grace had clearly been thinking about this. "I would like to name him Thomas, after my first husband. He would have been happy to know I found love again, and I want to honor his memory. But his middle name should be James, after your father." Frank felt his eyes prick with tears. "Thomas James O'Brien. It is perfect." He spent the rest of the evening sitting with Grace and their son, marveling at how much his life had changed in just over a year. From a lonely cowboy running from old heartbreak to a husband and father surrounded by love. In the years that followed, life continued to bless them. Grace took a few years off from teaching to focus on raising Thomas, but eventually returned to the schoolhouse when he was old enough to attend. Frank's ranch prospered, and they were able to expand, building a larger house with more bedrooms. 3 years after Thomas was born, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Rose. 2 years after that came another son, William Frank. Their house was full of life and laughter, noise and chaos, everything Frank had once dreamed of but thought he would never have. Marshal Crawford and his deputies eventually caught the third man responsible for attacking Grace and Thomas Miller. Grace testified at the trial, and all 3 men were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. It brought a sense of closure, though Grace never forgot Thomas or the life she had briefly had with him. She kept a small photograph of Thomas on a shelf in their bedroom, and sometimes Frank would find her looking at it with sad but peaceful eyes. He never felt jealous or threatened by it. Thomas had been part of her story, part of what made her who she was. And Frank was grateful that Grace's capacity to love had not died with her first husband, but had grown to include him as well. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank and Grace sat on their porch, watching their 3 children play in the yard. Thomas, at 9 years old, was teaching his sister Margaret how to rope a fence post. William, at 5, was chasing chickens and laughing when they squawked and ran from him. "Can you believe it has been 10 years?" Grace asked, leaning against Frank's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime," he replied, wrapping his arm around her. "Do you have any regrets?" "Not a single one." "Well, maybe I regret telling you that you worry too much when I was pregnant with Thomas." "You were right to worry given how Margaret decided to arrive 3 weeks early." Frank chuckled. "That was a terrifying night, but she was fine and you were fine." "We have been very blessed, Frank." "Sometimes I think about that night you found me crying by the creek, and I cannot believe how far we have come from that moment. I was at the absolute lowest point of my life, and you lifted me up." "We lifted each other up," Frank corrected. "You brought joy back into my life, Grace. You made me believe in love again when I had given up on it. You gave me a family and a purpose beyond just working myself into the ground." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in those familiar golds and crimsons. It reminded Frank of that first sunset when he had found Grace, when he had said those words that changed both their lives. "Whatever it is, you do not have to face it alone." He had meant it then, and he meant it now. They had faced everything together in the years since, the good and the bad, the joys and the sorrows. And they would continue to face whatever came, side by side, for the rest of their lives. Thomas came running up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Pa, can you teach me and Maggie how to rope from horseback tomorrow?" "May you," Grace corrected automatically. "Can you teach us, may you?" Thomas rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "May you teach us tomorrow, Pa?" "I think that can be arranged," Frank said, ruffling his son's hair. "Now go help your brother wash up for dinner. Ma has been cooking all afternoon and it smells mighty good." The children scampered off and Frank pulled Grace closer. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For saying yes when I asked you to marry me. For taking a chance on a lonely cowboy. For building this life with me." Grace turned and kissed him softly. "Thank you for finding me that day, for seeing past my tears and my grief to the person I could become, for loving me through the healing and beyond." "Always," Frank promised. "I will always love you, Grace O'Brien." "And I will always love you, Frank O'Brien, my cowboy, my husband, my heart." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they went inside to have dinner with their children. The house was warm and filled with love, the table laden with good food, the conversation lively and full of laughter. It was everything Frank had ever wanted, everything he had thought lost to him after Sarah. But fate, or maybe Providence, had brought Grace into his life at exactly the right moment. He had been riding hard, trying to outrun his own loneliness and pain, and instead he had found a woman who needed saving. In saving her, he had saved himself. In healing her broken heart, his own had healed as well. That night, after the children were tucked into bed and the house was quiet, Frank and Grace stood on their porch one more time, looking out at the land they had built their life on. "I think we did all right," Frank said. "Better than all right," Grace agreed. "We built something beautiful here, a family, a home, a legacy. It is not much by some standards. The house is not fancy. The ranch is not the biggest in the area. It is everything by the standards that matter. Our children are healthy and happy. We love each other. We have good friends and neighbors. What more could anyone want?" Frank had no answer to that because she was right. They had everything that mattered. He pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. This was home. This was love. This was the life that had begun that evening when he found her crying at sunset and offered her the one thing she needed most in that moment, someone to face the darkness with. And face it they had together, until they found their way through to the light. The years continued to unfold with their share of challenges and triumphs. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Thomas proved to have a natural talent for working with cattle and showed every sign of taking over the ranch someday. Margaret, much to Grace's delight and Frank's bemusement, had inherited her mother's love of learning and announced at age 12 that she wanted to be a teacher like her mother. William was still young but showed promise with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animals with patience and a soft touch. Grace's mother, who had been unable to attend their wedding due to financial constraints, finally made the journey west when Margaret was 6. She stayed for 3 months, and Frank watched as Grace blossomed under her mother's presence. The older woman was warm and kind, and she told Frank privately that she had never seen her daughter so happy. "After we lost my husband and then Thomas, I worried Grace would never recover, Mrs. Miller said one evening as they sat on the porch. Grace was inside putting the children to bed. "But you gave her back her life. You gave her love and security and a reason to keep going. I cannot thank you enough for that." "I love her," Frank said simply. "She makes me a better man." "And you clearly make her a better woman. I can see it in everything she does and how she looks at you and the children. She is content in a way I never thought possible." When Mrs. Miller returned to Missouri, it was with promises to visit again and with a standing invitation for Grace and Frank to bring the children to visit her. They managed the trip twice over the years, long journeys by train that the children found both exhausting and exciting. Frank's ranch continued to prosper, and by their 15th anniversary, he had built it into one of the most successful operations in the county. He employed several ranch hands and had expanded his herd significantly. The cattle market was strong, and the railroad made it easy to ship beef east where demand was high. But for all his success in business, Frank's greatest joy remained his family. He loved coming home after a long day of work to find Grace in the kitchen preparing dinner, the smell of bread, baking, and stew simmering. He loved the chaos of 3 active children, their questions and arguments and laughter. He loved the quiet moments alone with Grace after the children were asleep, sitting together by the fire or on the porch, talking about their day and their plans for tomorrow. On their 20th anniversary, Frank surprised Grace with a trip, just the 2 of them. They left the children in Mrs. Patterson's capable care and took the train to Denver for a week. It was the first time they had been truly alone together since their honeymoon, and it felt like a gift. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate at restaurants, attended a theater performance, and simply enjoyed being husband and wife without the responsibilities of parenting and running a household. They talked for hours, rediscovering each other in some ways, remembering why they had fallen in love in the first place. "I needed this," Grace said one evening as they walked through the city streets, her arm linked through his. "I love our children desperately, but sometimes I miss just being us." "I know what you mean. We have built a good life, but it is important to remember the foundation of it all, you and me." "Always you and me," Grace agreed. "Everything else flows from that." When they returned home, the children greeted them with such enthusiasm that Frank and Grace both felt guilty for having left, even though they knew the break had been necessary. Thomas, now 19, had managed the ranch beautifully in Frank's absence. Margaret, at 16, had kept the house running smoothly. And William, at 14, had simply been excited to have his parents back. Life settled back into its familiar rhythms. Thomas began courting a young woman named Elizabeth from town, and Frank watched with mixed emotions as his eldest prepared to start his own life. Grace assured him this was natural and good, that their job was to raise the children to be independent. But Frank still felt a pang at the thought of his son leaving. When Thomas and Elizabeth married 2 years later, Frank gave them a portion of the ranch land to build their own house and start their own herd. It was hard to let go, but also deeply satisfying to see his son so happy and settled. Margaret, true to her word, went to a teaching college in Kansas City when she was 18. Frank and Grace missed her terribly during the 2 years she was gone, but when she returned with her teaching certificate, their pride knew no bounds. She took a position teaching in a nearby town and boarded during the week, but came home most weekends. William, at 18, surprised them all by announcing he wanted to join the cavalry. It was 1896, and the frontier was closing, but there were still military posts throughout the West. Frank worried about his youngest son riding into danger, but he also recognized William's need to make his own way, to see something beyond the ranch. The day William left for basic training was one of the hardest of Frank's life. He held his son close and fought back tears. "You be careful out there. Listen to your superiors, keep your head down, and come home safe." "I will, Pa, I promise." Grace cried openly as the train pulled away and Frank held her, both of them waving until William was out of sight. That night the house felt too quiet, too empty. Their children were grown and gone, pursuing their own dreams. "When did they get so big?" Grace asked, wiping at her eyes. "It feels like just yesterday we were bringing Thomas home from the doctor." Time is strange that way. It drags in the moment but flies when you look back. They adjusted to being empty nesters, finding joy in the quiet but also in visits from their children. Thomas and Elizabeth had their first child, a girl they named Grace, and Frank felt his heart swell at the sight of his granddaughter. Margaret met a young lawyer in the town where she taught, and they married in a simple ceremony that nonetheless brought happy tears to Grace's eyes. William wrote regularly from his posting in Arizona, full of stories about desert landscapes and the men he served with. On their 25th anniversary, Frank and Grace renewed their vows in the same church where they had married. Thomas, Margaret, and William all came home for the occasion, bringing their respective families. The church was packed with friends and neighbors, and afterward, there was a celebration at the ranch. As Frank and Grace danced together under the stars, their children and grandchildren watching, Frank marveled again at the twists of fate that had brought them together. 25 years since they had stood in this same church and promised to love each other. 26 years since he had found her crying by that creek, lost and broken and afraid. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, her head resting on his shoulder as they swayed to the music. "That day I found you, how scared you were, how lost, And look at you now, surrounded by children and grandchildren, successful, happy. You have come so far." "We have come so far," Grace corrected. "I could not have done any of it without you. You gave me hope when I had none, love when I thought I would never feel it again, a future when I thought my life was over. And you gave me the same. I was just existing before you came into my life, going through the motions. You made me truly live again." They kissed, a soft and tender press of lips that still held all the love and passion of their early days, tempered now with deep familiarity and comfort. Around them, their family cheered and clapped, and Frank felt complete in a way he had never imagined possible all those years ago when he was a bitter, lonely man who thought love had passed him by. As they grew older, Frank and Grace settled into a comfortable retirement. Thomas took over full management of the ranch, running it with the same dedication Frank had shown. Margaret's children often came to stay during summers, and the ranch was filled again with the sounds of children playing and laughing. William eventually left the cavalry and settled on a small farm near Newton with his wife, visiting often and helping out at the ranch when needed. Frank and Grace spent their days much as they had in those early months when they were first falling in love, sitting on the porch, talking, watching the world go by. Grace's hair had turned silver, and Frank's face was deeply lined from years of working in the sun, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been. "You ever think about him?" Frank asked one day as they sat together. "Thomas Miller, I mean." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. Less as the years go by, but yes. I think about what my life would have been like if those men had not attacked us, if we had made it to Oregon. Would we have been happy? I like to think so. But I also know that life would not have been this life, and I cannot imagine any other life now. I am glad that even though you lost him, you did not lose yourself to the grief. I almost did. If you had not found me that day, I do not know what would have happened. I might have died out there on the prairie, or maybe I would have survived and lived a bitter, sad existence. But you saved me, Frank. In every way a person can be saved." Frank took her hand, his thumb brushing over the emerald ring she still wore, now loose on her thinner fingers. "We saved each other." They sat in silence, comfortable and content, watching the sunset paint the sky in those familiar colors. Even after all these years, Frank never tired of it. The beauty of the land, the peace of his home, the warmth of his wife beside him, these were the things that made life worth living. As the years passed and they both grew more frail, their children worried and suggested they might want to move to town, to be closer to medical care and have help nearby. But Frank and Grace refused. This ranch was their home, the place where they had built their life together. They would not leave it unless forced. On a warm spring evening in 1918, 40 years after that fateful day when Frank found Grace crying by the creek, they sat together on their porch one last time. Frank was 86 now, Grace 84. Both were in poor health, their bodies worn out from long lives fully lived. "You remember the first thing you said to me that day?" Grace asked softly. Frank smiled. "I asked if you were hurt. And then you said, whatever it is, you do not have to face it alone." Those words changed my life, Frank. They gave me hope when I had none. I meant them then, and I mean them now. We have faced everything together, Grace. The good and the bad, the joys and the sorrows, and we will face whatever comes next together too. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, just as she had done thousands of times over the decades. "I am not afraid, not as long as I am with you. Neither am I." They fell asleep there on the porch, wrapped in blankets, holding hands as the stars came out overhead. And when Thomas came to check on them in the morning, he found them still sitting together, still holding hands, peaceful expressions on their faces. They had passed together in the night, just as they had lived together in life side by side, facing everything as one. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from all over the county. Frank and Grace O'Brien had been beloved figures, known for their kindness, their strong marriage, and their generous spirits. Their children eulogized them through tears, speaking of parents who had loved fiercely and lived fully, who had shown them what true partnership looked like. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the shade of a cottonwood tree. The headstone was simple, bearing their names, dates, and a single inscription that Thomas had chosen. Whatever it is, you do not have to face it alone. The ranch continued under Thomas's management, passed eventually to his children and then to their children. The O'Brien name became synonymous with hard work, integrity, and family values in that part of Kansas. And though the world changed dramatically over the decades, automobiles replacing horses, electricity coming to rural areas, towns growing into cities, the story of Frank and Grace endured. It was told and retold at family gatherings, a love story that began with tears and ended with triumph. A reminder that even in our darkest moments, when we think we have lost everything, there can be hope. There can be new beginnings. There can be love. Because sometimes, when we are at our lowest, the right person comes along and says exactly what we need to hear. Whatever it is, you do not have to face it alone, and everything changes.